There is a difference between doubting yourself and doubting your skills, right? You're never saying, I think I'm an idiot, or I think I'm completely incapable of being a good entrepreneur or a great investor or a successful content creator. You're just saying, I don't know if I'm there yet. I think I have work to do. I have knowledge to pick up. I have expertise to gain. And I think what that is basically just having confidence in yourself as a learner, as opposed to as an expert or a master.
Hey everyone, welcome back to On Purpose, the #1 health podcast in the world. Thanks to each and every single one of you that come back every week to listen, learn, and grow. Now, I know that we talk a lot about learning, we talk a lot about growing, we talk a lot about thinking differently, but today we're actually talking about unlearning. We're talking about all the things that we need to reflect on and maybe rewire and renew our thoughts about, because I'm speaking with the one and only Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist at Wharton, who's been recognized as one of the world's 10 most influential management thinkers. He's also a New York Times bestselling author who has sold millions of copies of his books on generosity, driving success, nonconformist, moving the world, and building resilience after adversity. He currently writes for the New York Times about work and psychology and hosts Work Life, a podcast on how to make work not suck. His latest book, Think Again, is the topic of our conversation today. This book seems to cover so many of today's biggest challenges and mindsets that we're all struggling with, challenges that we're all having in our lives. Tell me why you thought now's the time to write Think Again, based on obviously all the years of study that you've done for it, but why was now the right time to get people to think again?
I actually didn't realize it was when I started working on Think Again. I think it was 3 years ago that I started writing it, and it just grew out of my frustration with people who were clinging to knowledge that was no longer accurate for a world that had changed a lot, or who were stuck to opinions that clearly it was time to question and maybe complicate a little bit. And I felt like, okay, this is a great time to say, I have spent my career as an organizational psychologist thinking again, right? My job is to rethink how we work, how we lead, how we live our lives. But I never really explored the process of thinking again and done a deep dive into the question of how do we update our own opinions and assumptions? How do we open other people's minds? And how do we build cultures of learning? So I set out to write this book. And then the pandemic hits when I'm about halfway through writing it. And suddenly we are all forced to rethink all these things that we've taken for granted most of our lives. Even something as basic as, can I hug my grandparents? Or can I go and eat in an indoor restaurant? Or will there be live sports on TV? And given all the rethinking that we've had to do because of the pandemic, it seemed like the right time to try to give people a general framework for how to think about it.
Yeah, asking people to think again is quite a bold thing to do, because we feel so safe in our regurgitated, pattern-oriented thoughts. Like, I feel that even now, a lot of what I hear is, oh, when are things going to go back, right? I'm still hearing that. And we hear things like, well, when are things going to be normal again? And it feels like we have such a stronghold as humans on safety, security, stability, certainty, and this idea of things staying the same, that when you say think again, it's like, well, actually, that's a lot of work. Like, it's almost like we're scared of that. So tell me about what you found, and why are we so obsessed with things staying the same and having that same thought, and where's the root of that?
Jay, it's ironic that you're asking me this question, right? As a monk, you specialize in helping people understand and accept impermanence. So let me ask you, why do you think we're so attached to our ideas and opinions as opposed to being willing to question them?
Look at you switching the interview over already, getting everyone to think again how they should structure their interview questions. Never to allow for this. From a very monk spiritual perspective, the idea would be is that we are all wired for spontaneity, for growth, for ever expansion, but through our education, through our parenting, through the conditioning of what we've experienced in this material world, we've become safer or feel safer in this false safety net of stability. And from a spiritual point of view, the idea would be that there is no such thing as stability. There is no security. Everything from the cells in our body through to our minds, through to every part of us in this material world is constantly changing. And so the idea of holding on to something, the root of that is because we feel, or we've been trained to believe that that's how you survive. That's how you're happy. That's how you're scared of almost taking a risk of what may happen if I let go of this, when actually when you live in a spiritually abundant life, you already know that movement and growth and expansion is the only way that you feel happiness. So from a very spiritual point of view, I could answer in many different ways, but from a very spiritual point of view, that would be seen as the root.
That tracks very closely with what we would say in psychology, which is, first of all, there's just a basic ego threat that comes from admitting that your opinions have changed, because that means you're saying, you know what, I was wrong. And for a lot of people, that makes them question their intelligence. It makes them worry that everyone else is going to find out that they're a fraud, and it plays into imposter syndrome. And then there's also a challenge of unpredictability, that if I need to change my opinion, there is a difference between doubting yourself and doubting your skills, right? You're never saying, I think I'm an idiot, or I think I'm completely incapable of being a good entrepreneur or a great investor or a successful content creator. You're just saying, I don't know if I'm there yet. I think I have work to do. I have knowledge to pick up. I have expertise to gain. And I think what that is basically just having confidence in yourself as a learner, as opposed to as an expert or a master.
Hey everyone, welcome back to On Purpose, the number one health podcast in the world. Thanks to each and every single one of you that come back every week to listen, learn, and grow. Now, I know that we talk a lot about learning, we talk a lot about growing, we talk a lot about thinking differently, but today we're actually talking about unlearning. We're talking about all the things that we need to reflect on and maybe rewire and renew our thoughts about, because I'm speaking with the one and only Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist at Wharton, who's been recognized as one of the world's 10 most influential management thinkers. He's also a New York Times bestselling author who has sold millions of copies of his books on generosity, driving success, nonconformist, moving the world, and building resilience after adversity. He currently writes for the New York Times about work and psychology and hosts Work Life, a podcast on how to make work not suck. His latest book, Think Again, is the topic of our conversation today. This book seems to cover so many of today's biggest challenges and mindsets that we're all struggling with, challenges that we're all having in our lives. Tell me why you thought now's the time to write Think Again, based on obviously all the years of study that you've done for it, but why was now the right time to get people to think again?
I actually didn't realize it was when I started working on Think Again. I think it was 3 years ago that I started writing it, and it just grew out of my frustration with people who were clinging to knowledge that was no longer accurate for a world that had changed a lot, or who were stuck to opinions that clearly it was time to question and maybe complicate a little bit. And I felt like, okay, this is a great time to say, I have spent my career as an organizational psychologist thinking again, right? My job is to rethink how we work, how we lead, how we live our lives. But I never really explored the process of thinking again and done a deep dive into the question of how do we update our own opinions and assumptions? How do we open other people's minds? And how do we build cultures of learning? So I set out to write this book. And then the pandemic hits when I'm about halfway through writing it. And suddenly we are all forced to rethink all these things that we've taken for granted most of our lives. Even something as basic as, can I hug my grandparents? Or can I go and eat in an indoor restaurant? Or will there be live sports on TV? And given all the rethinking that we've had to do because of the pandemic, it seemed like the right time to try to give people a general framework for how to think about it.
Yeah, asking people to think again is quite a bold thing to do, because we feel so safe in our regurgitated, pattern-oriented thoughts. Like, I feel that even now, a lot of what I hear is, oh, when are things going to go back, right? I'm still hearing that. And we hear things like, well, when are things going to be normal again? And it feels like we have such a stronghold as humans on safety, security, stability, certainty, and this idea of things staying the same, that when you say think again, it's like, well, actually, that's a lot of work. Like, it's almost like we're scared of that. So tell me about what you found and why are we so obsessed with things staying the same and having that same thought? And where's the root of that?
Jay, it's ironic that you're asking me this question, right? As a monk, you specialize in helping people understand and accept impermanence. So let me ask you, why do you think we're so attached to our ideas and opinions as opposed to being willing to question them?
Look at you switching the interview over already, getting everyone to think again how they should structure their interview questions. Never to allow for this. From a very monk spiritual perspective, the idea would be is that we are all wired for spontaneity, for growth, for ever expansion, but through our education, through our parenting, through the conditioning of what we've experienced in this material world, we've become safer or feel safer in this false safety net of stability. And from a spiritual point of view, the idea would be that there is no such thing as stability. There is no security. Everything from the cells in our body through to our minds, through to every part of us in this material world is constantly changing. And so the idea of holding on to something, the root of that is because we feel, or we've been trained to believe that that's how you survive. That's how you're happy. That's how you're scared of almost taking a risk of what may happen if I let go of this, when actually when you live in a spiritually abundant life, you already know that movement and growth and expansion is the only way that you feel happiness. So from a very spiritual point of view, I could answer in many different ways, but from a very spiritual point of view, that would be seen as the root.
That tracks very closely with what we would say in psychology, which is, first of all, there's just a basic ego threat that comes from admitting that your opinions have changed, because that means you're saying, you know what, I was wrong. And for a lot of people, that makes them question their intelligence. It makes them worry that everyone else is going to find out that they're a fraud, and it plays into imposter syndrome. And then there's also a challenge of unpredictability, that if I need to change my opinions every day or every hour or even every week or month, then how do I make sense of a world that is not standing still under my feet? And I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with that idea, and they like to maintain a sense of control by saying, look, if I stick to the comfort of conviction and avoid the discomfort of doubt, then I can feel like I have a grip on the world around me. And then I think there's a social piece of this too, which is belonging. Right? If I am willing to rethink some of my views, I'm putting myself at risk for being expelled from my group, right? I might be, in some ways, challenging my tribe. And that sense of exclusion, that risk of loneliness, is obviously something that's easier to steer clear of.
Yeah. So where do you draw the line between thinking again and being stable and feeling like you're in a safe space? Like, how do you kind of draw that line? Because I feel like from your studies, I'm sure you found places where it was good to not think again, or good to not question, and almost sometimes over questioning leads to overthinking and overanalyzing and procrastination. Tell us about that boundary.
Yeah, I think it's very tricky. It's probably a tightrope walk for a lot of people, but my read of the evidence is that when people start to make their opinions their identity, they get in trouble. So you believe a bunch of things and you say, well, that's who I am. And I would love for people to imagine rewinding the clock half a century or a century or more and say, okay, if you made your opinions or your beliefs your identity, and let's say you're a teacher, you might have seen yourself as a corporal punisher, right? Whose job it is to discipline students. Or if you were a doctor, you would have said, all right, I'm a professional lobotomist. And what I do is I solve all kinds of medical problems by taking out part of the frontal lobe. Or if you were a police officer, you might have seen yourself more recently as a stop and frisker. And the problem with all these identities is they're attached to policies and practices that we now know are counterproductive. I think what we want is to build our identities around our values. And that's where we're looking for a little bit more stability and groundedness. So I want to go to the doctor who says, My values are around protecting and promoting health. And I'm open to rethinking what are the best procedures to do that, right? I want to go to the police officer who says, I'm here to promote justice and safety. And I'm not sure what the best ways to do that are, but I'm going to look at the data. And I definitely want to send my kids to the teacher who says, I'm here to help kids learn first and foremost. And I'm not going to commit to any one way of doing that. And I don't know that we should always freeze our values, right? I think they should evolve too, but it's a lot easier for me to say my core values are generosity, excellence, integrity, and freedom. And I'm going to be pretty flexible about learning the most effective ways to live by those values. What do you think about that?
I think that's such a great distinction. I've never heard it put that way, but I really appreciate that. For me, that's been really clarifying about how your values, as you said, they don't need to be frozen. They can evolve as well. But the idea is that you have a set of values, but you're flexible and adaptable about how they come to life at different times in your life. And I often say to people, like, I love the books that I studied living as a monk, and I got so much value from them, and I obviously share them, but I'm always open to discovering some new spiritual truth that I'm not accustomed to or aware of when I'm speaking to someone, because I just want to be a seeker of the truth. And I think that allows me to have this very deep affinity for the work that I've done, but not a sentimental attachment to them, if that makes sense. And I think that's what I was getting from you, is that often we create this sentimental attachment to our beliefs because we feel they define us, as opposed to feeling, well, I have this very strong loyalty, but I'm still able to peruse and search and discover.
I think you nailed it. Attachment is such a barrier for so many people to rethinking opinions and ideas that are no longer serving them well. And this isn't just true with the things we believe about the world, right? It's also true for the plans that we make. So you mentioned a lot of people are asking, when are we going back? And obviously, I think you and I would both say, well, actually, let's just try to move forward.
Yes.
But it's so common for people to get attached to early images that they formed of how they wanted to live their lives and who they wanted to be, right? Anybody who ever was asked the question as a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? And had an answer like, well, I'm going to be a lawyer, or I'm going to be a doctor. And then 20 or 30 years later, is still locked into that plan, never really questioning, does that make sense for me? There's a term in psychology for that. It's called identity foreclosure. And it's the idea of sort of seizing and freezing too early on a sense of who you want to be before you've really explored alternatives. And I think the danger of that is what you want, what you value, what you're looking for in life is going to evolve over time. And I think we need our identities to evolve with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I guess people struggle with thinking again because we're almost like, where do we start? Like, what value do you start on? What part of your life do you start on? In your studies, where did you find a good place to start thinking again? Like, because I feel like you're opening up like a can of worms of like childhood trauma. You know, it's like people don't know where to start. So where did you start?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that question, because I think it's going to be a little different for everyone. But let's continue on the plan path for a second and say, okay, a lot of people have career regrets, right? They started down a path and then they fell victim to escalation of commitment to a losing course of action, which is where you invest time and energy and money in a path, and then you discover, you know what, this isn't quite what I wanted it to be. And instead of cutting your losses, you double down. And economists will say that's because of sunk costs, right? You don't want to admit that you've wasted all that time and money. But the psychological factors are even more important. Ego and image. I don't want to look in the mirror and admit to myself that I made a stupid decision. And I want to prove to everybody else that I made a smart one. And so I get caught in this self-justification spiral where I'm rationalizing my past choices as opposed to rethinking them. And what I've advised my students to do for years is to say, look, you know what? You go to the doctor or the dentist when you're healthy a couple times a year just for a checkup. Maybe we should have career checkups. Put a reminder in your calendar twice a year to ask yourself, have I reached a learning plateau in my job, or a lifestyle plateau for that matter? Have I learned something new about what my strengths are or my values are? And is it possible that this culture is no longer serving those? And I think having that kind of checkpoint is a great way to keep yourself honest and make sure that you do some rethinking about what your plans are. And I don't think it has to be limited to career, right? I think we could do occasional marriage checkups. We could do all kinds of life decision checkups. I think a lot of people have done this during the pandemic, saying, wait a minute, where in the world do I want to live? I don't need to be tethered to the city that I've been for the last 8 years.
That's such a practical piece of advice. And I love that one. And we're almost scared of asking that. I want to talk to you a bit about that fear of addressing that, because we're scared of asking that question because of the idea of, well, what if I hate my job? And then now from tomorrow, I know I hate my job and then I'm just going to be depressed. Or if I ask that question about my partner, then maybe we need to get a divorce or maybe we need to break up. How do we curb our fear of even asking that question and thinking again? Because that seems to be one of the biggest blocks to even getting to that point of doing that checkup.
I think a lot of this is about regret. In the long run, the decisions that we tend to regret are not our actions, they're our inactions. They're the chances that we didn't take. And I think in a lot of cases, right, rebooting your career or rethinking a relationship is scary. You know what's even scarier? Never even considering that possibility in the first place. And so, look, I think everybody's afraid of taking a risk or failing at some level. What we want to do is remember that we should be even more afraid of failing to try.
Yeah, I think regrets is such a big one that I've often thought about a lot and has helped me so much in my life. I remember even before I started creating content, I remember asking myself, would I regret not trying? Because obviously when you start something, and I'm sure you felt this when you started studying or when you became an author for the first time, it's almost like, will I regret not trying? Because you don't know if it's going to work. And you're so right that now I look back and I think, wow, I would have had massive regrets. Not because you know where things can go, but to be in that same place again and again and again and again and again. And I think that's what we don't remember, is that we're always worried about what if the next step doesn't work out, not realizing that this step we're on right now isn't feeling great either.
I think there's so much wisdom in that. And a funny place that you can see it is with students who are taking tests.
Yeah.
Where you see that students are really reluctant once they've come up with an answer to change their response. Even though the data show that on average, if you're willing to override your first instinct, you actually improve your score. And hilariously, when we tell students this, they still are reluctant to rethink their answers. And I think regret is a huge factor here, because imagine the pain of saying, I had the right answer and I undid it.
Yeah.
As opposed to if I just stick to my gut and I don't rethink it, well, it doesn't seem like I was ever going to get it right in the first place. And I think if we're not careful, that can obviously steer us in the wrong direction.
That's crazy that even when you tell people, students in that example, that they still don't change. Like, why is it that, how many times do we have to hear something to know that it works out of? Have you figured this out? Like what do we need? What is needed to genuinely change? Like, what is needed to genuinely think again and act on that thinking?
I think probably the most relevant data I've seen is from studies of leaders introducing organizational changes and trying to bring a new vision into a team or into a company. And on average, in the classic data, leaders undercommunicated their visions by a multiple of 8. 8 times less often than people needed to hear the vision, they explained it. And I think a lot of that is because once you come up with the vision, it makes perfect sense to you. It's crystal clear in your head, right? You spent days or weeks or months or maybe years thinking through this. And so the first time you say it, you assume everyone else gets it. Yeah. But obviously they don't the first time you explain it. And I don't know for any person whether that multiple is under communicating by 3 or 17, but I think on average, we probably underdo it for the most part. And what I often tell leaders is the moment you'll know that you've really gotten through to people is when they say, okay, enough already. I get it. I'm tired of hearing it. And that's when you know you've really gotten your point across.
Yeah, it's almost like you don't know. Every time you feel you've oversaid it, you haven't until that person thinks you've oversaid it. Until I guess until you feel your team or your partner can complete your sentence, right? It's almost like looking at Google. Like Google can autocomplete because it knows what most of us are asking all of the time. And the idea that if I was going to say something and you could complete my sentence, chances are I've said it way too much. It's like It's like that feeling of when your friend or your partner says something like, yeah, you've told me that story like 72 times. Like I know exactly what your mom does in that scenario, whatever it may be. That's a good checking system. I like that. I really like that. I think I undervalue that too. We assume everyone thinks like us.
We do. And I would say the most powerful form of persuasion is self-persuasion. And that means that instead of having to repeat your vision over and over again, you explain it once or twice, and then you ask people to articulate it in their own words. And what they often think they're doing is trying to get other people fired up about it. But really what they're doing is they're internalizing it and convincing themselves that this is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned in your book that people tend to slip into there's a few, but there's one more, but the mindsets of three different professions when they think and talk. And I love this. I really, really like this. So you said preacher, politician, and prosecutor. Tell us a bit about those and give us some examples of those so that we can understand. And everyone who's listening and watching, what I want you to do is reflect on when you fall into one of these, because we all fall into them at different times in our life. So if you're listening right now or watching, please reflect on, as Adam's guiding us through, when in your life you do one of these things. So Adam.
Such a fun direction to go. I hardly even know where to start, in part because when I think about my life as an organizational psychologist, it is incredibly peculiar to me that although I've never worked as a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician, somehow all of those occupations managed to waltz into my mind during my daily life. And I think that's true for all of us. So the original idea comes from a brilliant paper that my colleague Phil Tetlock wrote. And the idea is that we are social creatures, right? That we're very concerned with our standing in the world and what other people think of us. And that a lot of the time when we think we're making rational decisions, we're actually paying a ton of attention to where we fit into a social hierarchy. When we're in preacher mode, we believe that we have found the truth. And our job is to go out and proselytize our sacred beliefs and get other people on board with them. Prosecutor mode is sort of the reverse. That's about saying, you know what? I've got to win an argument. You are wrong. And then politician mode is essentially campaigning for the approval of an audience, right? Trying to lobby to get a tribe on board with whatever you think they want to hear, or trying to earn their admiration in some way. And I think the thing that I worry most about is if you're in preacher or prosecutor mode, you don't do enough rethinking because you already believe you're right and everyone else is wrong. So why would you ever change your mind? And in politician mode, we see more flexibility, but it kind of looks like flip-flopping, right? I don't really believe what I'm saying. I'm just trying to appease my audience and cater to what they want to hear. Right. And so, it looks like I'm rethinking at the wrong times and maybe for the wrong reasons. Jay, I'm curious, of these three modes, which one is your biggest vice?
Which one is my biggest vice? It would definitely, for years, I would say it's the preacher one for sure. Like I think for years, and I find that especially when you're in an early stage, formative stage of a set of beliefs, preacher is very natural. So I remember when I first started getting involved in spiritual teachings, it was like I was preaching to my parents. I'm like preaching to all my friends, and you like
here's how you should have raised me.
Yeah, exactly. And you like push everyone in your life away from you because you think you've figured it out, and you forget that this person has a bit more age, they have a bit more maturity, there's things that come with life and time and experience. And so I think for long parts of my life, especially in early stages of anything, I think I've naturally shifted into that and then slowly tried to move away from that as much as I can, hopefully into the fourth mindset, which we'll talk about. But yes, in answer to your question, I would say my biggest vice has definitely been the preacher mode.
That's so interesting. I've thought about this over the years, and whenever I encounter somebody who I think is pretty frequently in preacher mode, I just think, okay, you know what? Highly effective for appealing to their existing followers, right? Because there's a group of people who are already drinking that Kool-Aid, and it's very inspiring, and it gives you a sense that you've found some kind of enlightenment. But to everybody else, like, why are you trying to force feed me your wisdom, right? I didn't sign up for this. Back off. And so I think the more resistant or skeptical an audience is, the more likely that preaching is to backfire.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's where I started to realize, and it was more so, luckily I feel like I caught it early where I was just like, well, actually, I only want to, I just want to discover more. And hence the podcast has been phenomenal for that, because I'm sitting with people who can share ideas and insights that may be different to what I've grown up with, or challenging sometimes, and sometimes even sparking debate in a positive sense. And so I think that's why sitting down with people from different, I mean, me and you didn't grow up in the same area. We didn't grow up around the same group of people. And we don't even stay fascinated in necessarily the same types of thought on a daily basis. And therefore, this conversation allows me to do that. And that's why I think the podcast, or the idea of sitting down with someone, is so powerful.
It is, even though one of us is having a very bad hair life.
Or a great one. Or a great one. So, but the fourth mindset, which you say is almost like the best mindset to be in, or one that you encourage, is the mindset of the scientist. Tell us about how we shouldn't just look at that as like, oh, I have to be like a scientist, but what that mindset actually means.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that anybody has to go and become Einstein or Bill Nye the Science Guy, right? The thought is, you don't have to work in a lab, you don't have to wear a white coat or carry around test tubes. I think about being a scientist as a way of seeing the world and a way of navigating your life. I think that what scientists value is truth, right? Trying to get closer to truth, even if they might never really find it. Mm-hmm. And that means whatever opinions they form are tentative, right? They're hunches. They might be hypotheses. And what I need to do as a scientist is, when I have an idea, I want to go out into the world and explore whether it's true, and better yet, when it's true. Yeah. That means I might run some little experiments. I might do observations. I might interview people, right? If I were going to go into sort of anthropologist mode. And the hope is that I'm going to discover sometimes that I was wrong. And I'm going to discover information that challenges my beliefs, not just that affirms my beliefs. And after all, I think that's what learning is about, Jay, right? Evolving our beliefs, not just validating what we already think is true. And I'm actually starting to rethink this a little bit, because I think the data are really compelling. So, there's an incredible experiment with Italian founders where some of them are randomly assigned. These are entrepreneurs who are pre-revenue. And there's a control group who basically takes a couple-month entrepreneurship course. And then there's another group that gets the same education in how to start a business, only they're taught to think like scientists. And this is a little bit foreign for business people, right? But they're encouraged to just say, look, you know what? Your strategy, that's just a theory about a future state of the world and how your company can succeed in it. Your customer interviews, those are ways to develop hypotheses about where your theory would be successful. And then you build a minimum viable product. That is an experiment to run. And then what data do you need to find out if your experiment worked or didn't? So the control group over the next year makes less than $300 in revenue on average per startup. Wow. The scientist group makes over $12,000 in that year on average per startup. It's a staggering effect.
Yeah.
It's driven by the fact that the scientists are more willing to pivot. That when they're encouraged to think like scientists, they say, you know what, my strategy might have been bad. My hypotheses might have been wrong. I'm willing to change gears. And so I stopped there and said, wow, if we can teach business people to think more like scientists, if we can teach entrepreneurs to be a little bit more disciplined that way and experimental in their approach, that's actually good for their success and growth. And I was excited there. But I have a hunch that you know why I'm rethinking this now. What do you think is maybe missing from this perspective?
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking along those lines. I was agreeing with you. Now that you're asking me that question, yeah, I was agreeing with you. I felt like that makes a lot of sense. What's missing from that? Interesting. I'd love to reflect on that for a moment. Give me a second. Let me think. Yeah, let me think about what do I think's missing from that. I was in agreement with you because I found in my life, and even as even as simply as a content creator, which isn't what I am as a total, but if I look at that part of my life, that rule holds so true, is that if you just say, oh, I only want to make this and I'm going to put it out, people may never watch it or connect it or communicate with it, engage with it. So what is missing? I wonder whether the missing layer is the idea of, and I could be totally wrong. The only thing I can think of is the idea of discovery and then commitment. Like when do you actually finally commit, rather than continually testing, and that could just go on forever. That's the only thing that came to mind, and that may be way off, but that's what came to mind.
That's one of the couple of things that have been on my list right now. I guess one of two, to be more specific. So yeah, I think there's a risk that if you're a scientist, you're always rethinking, you're always questioning. You never believe that you found the truth. You ruled out a bunch of hypotheses that were wrong, but you only have a model and it's just an approximation of reality. Mm-hmm. I think the best antidote that I've come across to that is something that Bob Sutton has said for years, which is, in his view, an attitude of wisdom is acting on the best information you have while constantly doubting what you know.
Yeah.
And I think a good scientist probably does that. The other thing that I've been questioning a little bit is the scientist mindset pushing people too much toward sort of formal quantitative inquiry, right? Saying you can only arrive at knowledge through rigorous A/B testing. Right. And I think you're such a great person to toss this around with, because I think if I were to broaden, maybe what I really mean is you want to be in the mindset of a scholar. Right? Somebody who has the humility and the curiosity to know what they don't know and always be searching for new insights. And of course, science is one of the tools to do that. But as you've discovered in your life, there are also more spiritual paths to that kind of inquiry, right? And so I wonder what your take is on the scientist versus the scholar.
I try and approach my life, and I haven't used these terms before as how I see myself, but in the way you're discussing it, of like a spiritual scientist. And what I mean by that is, I feel like to get things done, you have to have the scientific approach, but I love looking at insight with intuition, or like data with the dynamic nature of spirituality. And I love trying to find that almost like the middle of the Venn diagram of where that collides, because that's where I find like real creativity is found. That's where I find like energy is created. It's almost like I never feel satisfied if I'm only seeking internally, if I don't test that externally, or if we're just testing loads of stuff externally, but it's not inspired from within. And so to me, I love the juxtaposition of both of those elements, like the scholar and the scientist. And as you said, because I feel like too many of us, and this is part of thinking again, too many of us are trying to be just one thing. And I often get the feedback of like, Jay, you used to be a monk. How can you be in media now? Like, how can you be on social media?
Yeah, it usually goes the other direction, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I just open my heart and I'm honest. I'm literally just experimenting with what feels right to me. Like it felt right to me to become a monk when I was 22. And I'm 33 now. And at this age, it feels really right to be doing what I'm doing now. And I'm allowing myself to grow and evolve and not have a simplified identity. And so I feel that the scholar and the scientist together, or the spiritual scientist together, can be a really fascinating place for people to live.
That Venn diagram is such an exciting thing when you're able to see the overlap. There's actually an example that jumped out at me when I was writing Think Again. We had a doctoral student, Danielle Tussing, who is now a professor at SUNY Buffalo. And Danielle decided she was going to rethink the importance of ambition in leadership. And she said, I wonder if there's something to being a little bit reluctant as a leader, to having some hesitations about taking the helm. You might be concerned about the implications for work-life balance. You might be daunted by the responsibility and worried about being racked with guilt. You might just be concerned that you're not qualified. And she ended up, it was hard to study this because there aren't that many people who rise to leadership roles that said, no, I don't want it. Keep me out of here. No, thank you. But she ended up studying charge nurses in hospitals who get rotated, and whether they seek the leadership role or not, on a certain number of shifts will go by, and then it's basically your turn. And so she was able to measure how reluctant they felt about leading. And she found that a little bit of reluctance actually predicted higher leadership effectiveness as rated by the people they worked with. And that was in part because the reluctant leaders were more willing to empower the people around them. They were less likely to assume, I know all the answers. They were more likely to seek out second opinions. And I thought this was such a cool finding. And then we were talking about this and we started thinking through, okay, where else has this idea appeared? And it turns out that Plato had this insight, right? So ancient Greek wisdom was, you know what? The person that we want to elect to a leadership role is the one who is very hesitant to be in charge. And then Douglas Adams wrote about it in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? That the only person we should want as a president is the one who had no interest in doing the job. And that's one of those moments where the Venn diagram comes together and you say, okay, if one of the great ancient Greek philosophers, one of the great modern British sci-fi writers, and empirical evidence are converging, there might be something here.
Yeah. I love those examples. I'm so glad you shared those because it's such a refreshing way of thinking. I think we always believe that the person who should get it is the person who puts themselves forward, the person who's confident about it. It's, it has that kind of self-belief that they were meant to be that person. And I'm guessing there's truth in that too. Sometimes the best athletes in the field are people who believe that they were going to be the best athletes of all time. But at the same time, when you look at leadership and business and even spiritual traditions, I mean, that's very true of monk culture and looking at spiritual rankings, that the person who went on to be the master teacher would rarely be the person who thought they were the master teacher. It would always be almost like humility was the key to the door of that person not feeling they were worthy, allowed them to be the best and caring leader.
Wow, we could use a lot more of that humility in the world right now. I think a lot of people write it off and they misunderstand humility as having low self-esteem or having just a low opinion of yourself. And if you go back to the Latin root of humility, it's actually being grounded. It means from the earth, right? And so humility is about recognizing, hey, we're all human. We're fallible, we're flawed, we have limitations and weaknesses. And I think if you see it that way, it becomes a source of strength, because if you can see your weaknesses more clearly, then you can figure out how to overcome them.
What we reward, we repeat. And so we're seeing people always rewarded for not being vulnerable or not being honest and transparent. And, I remember looking at some, basic studies on how men and women approach job specifications and job descriptions. And it was showing how women look at a job description and be like, oh, I can only do 25% of that. And whereas a man would look in and be like, oh, I can do over 50% of that. And so it's like they feel confident based on what they can do, whereas a woman may not. And so what I was finding fascinating about that, the over-amplification in one's beliefs is almost rewarded in a job interview. How do you start to reconstruct that and even me as an employer, and you work with some of the biggest employers on the planet, how do you reconstruct that in a healthy way so that you are hiring the right person eventually? Because there's a bit of a dichotomy there.
There is. I think the place I would start is to say we've got to stop confusing confidence for competence. Right? The fact that somebody believes they can do something is not a good proxy for their actual ability to do it. And in fact, you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect in psychology. The finding is that the people who have the lowest emotional intelligence scores and also the poorest logical reasoning abilities are the most likely to overestimate their abilities. And you could just say, okay, some of that's ego, but some of it is also, if you have no idea what emotional intelligence looks like, then it's really hard for you to judge whether you have it or not, right? And the same thing is true for logical reasoning skills. And I think in a job interview context, the place I like to start is to ask people to demonstrate what they're bringing to the table, right? I'll give them a tryout. I'll let them do a little bit of an experiment to show me their skills. I also, though, have started betting on people who underestimate themselves a little bit. There was a great study at Google a few years back of engineers. And this speaks to the gender differences you were just highlighting. It turned out that when you looked at self-ratings of how great you are as an engineer on a 1 to 5 scale, in order for women to make it at Google, they had to give themselves a 5. They had to have this unassailable confidence to say, look, I know I'm one of the best engineers in the world. Otherwise, they were just constantly feeling discouraged and probably facing more gender bias than anybody should. The most successful male engineers gave themselves a 4. Not a 5. The 5s were arrogant. Like, I'm the best. And they closed their minds to learning. And I think the 4s were like the experts that you and I would both admire. They didn't boast about how much they knew. They were constantly marveling at how much more they had to learn. And I would love to live in a world where everybody who self-rates as a 4 is more successful. And I think we have a lot of work to do there to remove some of those barriers that women face.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you shared that with me. In a small way, I found even with my own teams, we always did a self-assessment and then a manager assessment of the individual. And I always found that I always rated people higher. The people that I rated higher and they rated themselves lower were always my top performers. So I actually saw them as better than they saw themselves. And that was such a beautiful thing where I'm like, well, I think your score is like 45 out of 50. And they're like, oh, I see myself as like a 38. And I'm like, what? Like, that's amazing.
You're hired.
Yeah. And then the opposite was true also, where I saw people as like a 38 or a 35 and they saw themselves as a 50. And I was just like, okay, well, there's something wrong here. And you're so right about that.
We could probably add a few other explanations to that puzzle. One is Angela Duckworth has shown with grit that the grittiest people often rate themselves more in the 4 range than the 5 range because they have much higher standards for what counts as having real passion and perseverance. And they never feel like they've made it.
Yeah.
And then another factor is we had another student, Basima, who's now an MIT professor, and she studied how often people have imposter thoughts, feeling like, other people might find out that I'm a fraud, that I'm not as good as, as they think I am, that I don't deserve my successes. And a lot of people see, if you had a chronic imposter syndrome, they see that as debilitating. And it can be if you're just plagued by those doubts. But the more ordinary imposter thoughts that we all feel occasionally, gee, I wonder if I'm good enough, or I wonder if I've lost it and I'm no longer at my peak. People who had those thoughts more often actually were motivated to perform better. They didn't get complacent. Right? They didn't fall victim to what's often called a fat cat syndrome. They said, you know what? I might not be that good. I've got to work that much harder. I've got to learn that much more in order to make it.
And that's why I know you talk about this, that imposter syndrome actually has some benefits. Like it can actually be used. And I feel like now when we feel imposter syndrome, we often think of like, oh, I don't want to feel that way anymore. I would love for you to talk a bit more about more of the benefits of imposter syndrome. I think that could really benefit our community because that's been a really hot topic and important topic for us. I know for me, imposter syndrome has always showed me my skills gap. So I've never seen imposter syndrome as a identity issue or a issue of like my self-confidence or esteem. It showed me a skills gap. So if I feel I don't know how to, it was the first time I think I sat at a table with investors or whatever it was. And I was like, oh, I've never invested. I don't know what this means. Like, and all of a sudden you feel this sense of imposter syndrome. And I realized it was just a skills gap every time. And I love using it as a signal of asking myself, is that a skill I want to learn? And sometimes it's like, no, I don't care. And sometimes it's like, yeah, I'd love to learn that. So tell us a bit more about the benefits of imposter syndrome.
I think you just framed that so beautifully. And I think it probably calls to mind a caveat before we go into how to build on that, which is the response you're describing, Basima finds is more common for men than women. When men experience those imposter thoughts, we've had often the luxury of going through our lives with other people assuming that we were competent, right? So people hear you speak and they hear how eloquent you are and they say, you know what, this guy clearly knows what he's doing. And so it doesn't end up really crushing your motivation when you question yourself. Whereas I think in a lot of places, women, especially if they've been raised in a male-dominated world or a less egalitarian or more paternalistic culture, are more likely to have these ongoing fears about, well, am I worthy? Do people really think I can make it? And they haven't had these constant jolts of confidence that maybe even were unearned in a lot of cases. And so that response is rarer among women than men, but we see it across the board with all genders. And I think the starting point is to say, look, there is a difference between doubting yourself and doubting your skills. And that's why I love how you described your skills gap, right? You're never saying, I think I'm an idiot, or I think I'm completely incapable of being a good entrepreneur or a great investor or a successful content creator. You're just saying, I don't know if I'm there yet. I think I have work to do. I have knowledge to pick up. I have expertise to gain. And I think what that is basically just having confidence in yourself as a learner, as opposed to as an expert or a master.
I love what you just said, the idea of having confidence in yourself as a learner. And you develop that when you learn how to learn things. Like it's almost like that feeling of like, I know that if I wanted to, I could learn this. How do we develop the ability to learn? And unlearn, of course, is part of that, because I feel like that's what's missing. We don't believe that even if we had the time and even if we made the effort that we'd quite get there. because we've never been taught how to learn. We've never been taught how to pick something up and roll with it. Where do you start in that process?
Well, in the growth mindset research, there's a simple exercise that really seems to help people. And it's one that I've used in some of my own experiments and been surprised by how effective it is. What you ask people to do is just reflect on a time when they started out terrible at something and then got halfway decent or even good.
Mm.
And you say, look, you know what? You've been learning your whole life, whether you realize it or not. And if you analyze some of your own moments of progress and improvement, you're probably going to pick up patterns. And so in some cases, what people notice then is, okay, I learned through observation. And, I had a role model that I was able to watch closely, or I found the right videos on YouTube and I was able to pick this up. Other people will say, you know what, the pattern behind my moments of growth is I had a coach who was in my corner and who saw more potential in me than I saw in myself. And so now I need to find that person to raise my aspirations. And then for other people, it's as simple as saying, you know what, when I learned best, when I was most motivated to grow, was when I had a curiosity gap. I really wanted to understand something and it almost hurt. I wanted to scratch that itch so badly and I couldn't stop myself from then going and digging deeply into that phenomenon. And I think there are dozens and probably hundreds and thousands of possible stories that come out that way. But I think reflecting on your own moments of learning is probably the best way to figure out where your confidence in learning should come from.
Yeah, for sure. Because it could go back as I remember, like, if someone asked me what was the first time I felt like I was learning something, I was probably in grade 4. I had the best teacher of all time. His name was Mr. Foxwell, and I'll never forget him because he just made learning so fun. And I was probably like, 8, 9 years old maybe. And so, super young and not necessarily thinking about being a learner or thinking I'd be sitting talking to you about learning. But I remember that really strongly. And I remember it was being with someone who made learning so infectious. And now if I think back to anything that I've learned in my life, coaching has been the number one part of it. Like being around someone who energy is contagious and infectious because they love this thing so much, whatever it may be. And I think that's what it's been. I haven't just been around experts. I've been lucky to be around people who love what they did and were very compassionate with it. And I think those two qualities are so beautiful because when you learn just from an expert, it's different from learning from a compassionate expert. Like that has some very special pass-ons, I feel.
So there's a classic study by Benjamin Bloom where he looked at people who had been elite across a lot of different fields. He looked at Olympic swimmers, world-class tennis players, scientists, musicians, chess players, and he wanted to know what in their upbringing was common. And he found that they were rarely the most talented in even in their city when they were 12, 13 years old. But one of the distinguishing factors that set them apart from their peers was they had a first teacher or a first coach who made learning fun, which is exactly what you're getting at, where, all the deliberate practice, all the hard work that a lot of people would say, you know what, it's a grind, it's not going to be pleasant. They actually learned to experience that as rewarding, and that motivated them to keep going. And it sounds like you had that experience too. I'm curious, what did Mr. Foxwell do that made learning so fun?
I think he was one of the first people that introduced a lot of games at school as part of the learning process. So I can't remember what we're learning in grade 4, but the idea of everything was gamified. I didn't know what that word was then, but it was this opportunity where everything was play. I think that was a big part of it. He was also extremely animated and charismatic, and he was providing a lot of energy in what he was sharing and teaching. And I'd say at the same time, he was able to change the classroom. He was one of the first teachers we had that would, and this is, I'm talking about, like 25 years ago, he was taking classrooms outdoors. He was, taking the class in the playground. He was taking it on the lawn. He wasn't trying to keep us cooped up in this building. And so I felt like he was quite a visionary for, a small class in a small suburb in London. Like he was really taking risks and trying new things, I guess.
He sounds a lot like this incredible teacher that I got to know while I was working on Think Again, Ron Berger. Oh. Ron, of all the teachers I've met since I finished school, he's probably the person I most regret not getting to be in a classroom with. He, for years, taught in rural Massachusetts, in a tiny town where today his his nurse and his firefighter and his plumber are all his former students. And
Wow.
Ron was interested in teaching students an ethic of excellence. And he's a do-it-yourself kind of guy. He's very crafty. And he decided that he was going to do exactly what Mr. Foxwell did, which was he would take students out into the world to learn. And so when they were trying to learn about gas and radon, they actually went and did measurements in local communities. When they were trying to understand scientific classification and taxonomies of animals, he had the students come up with their own taxonomies. And, some people sorted animals by size, others did it by whether they had sharp teeth, others did it by color or habitat. And they realized, there are all these interesting choices that scientists make, and those are always open to being rethought. My favorite Ron Berger practice is teaching students to recognize that rethinking and revising your work is actually an enjoyable opportunity as opposed to a chore. Yeah. And what he would do is he would send first graders even off to draw a house. And then instead of saying draw a house, he says, we're going to do 4 different versions of a house. And they accept that their first draft is just a work in progress. And a lot of people told him, don't do this because you're going to leave students frustrated. They're going to get discouraged very easily. How many first graders want to do the same drawing 4 times? And he said, you have no idea. After they do the first draft, they can see problems in their drawings and they are so excited to rethink them and refine them. Yeah. And his students will often then, after that experience, insist on doing 7 or 8 different drafts before they turn something in. And I was just blown away by this. And I had our kids try it. And our 9-year-old daughter and our 6-year-old son were working on some art. And I said, okay, you know what? You can draw whatever you want. And then we're going to try a second and a third. And they just lit up. And then the next day they said, I'm going to do a few different drafts and I don't want you to frame the first one. And I think teaching that joy of rethinking is something we should all be lucky to be part of.
Yeah, because the truth is most of us get it right after a couple of goes anyway. And the idea that you had to get it right the first time is actually what's created this whole issue. Is we've been trained to believe you had to get it right the first time. And that was the only way that you got the reward and then you got the mark. And you're reminding me actually of my art teacher. So I loved art at high school. And I was always very good at graphic design and digital art or collages as opposed to fine art. I'm terrible at painting. But I had that, and my teacher would always ask me why I did that. Like why I put that color next to that color or why I put this image next to this image. And if I couldn't explain to him coherently why I did that, he wouldn't want to grade that piece. So he wouldn't give me a bad grade. He would just delay the grade until I could explain to him or come up with a real reason for why it was done. And it's so fascinating that when I think about where did I develop the mindset to act intentionally, it all came from him saying to me, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Why did you do that? And the idea of having to explain it and rethink why I did it was the only way that he was satisfied, as opposed to how it looked or how it appeared.
That's very powerful. And I'm wondering if part of what happens then is, he's going to ask you. And so you actually think through your choices up front the next time.
Yeah. And then he would still do it. He would ask about a part that and it would annoy me. Like I would be really frustrated because someone else in the class would get a good grade and, mine would be delayed grading and whatever. And I'd be like, well, mine looks better. And, you'd have all those thoughts. And he would just keep challenging me. And I think that was such an important piece of teaching that has stayed with me for so long. But I wanted to move forward in a few other topics that you talk about in the book. One of the big ones you talk about is charged, conflicted, debate level conversations. And these exist in the workplace, they exist at home. When I think about this, I think about relationships and marriage and in families where we constantly argue. And I think that's one of the places where we do the least unlearning, because we have such strong views about our family and our upbringing versus our partners or other people in our family that it's so hard to let go of it. Tell us a bit about what you learned about depolarizing a charged conversation or a debate where you just keep arguing the same point every week, which is very common.
Yeah, I feel like this is happening everywhere now, and the world has just gotten more polarized.
Mm.
One of the funnier studies I came across during the research for the book was that a third of women said that their pets were better listeners than their partners.
That's brilliant.
I mean, I guess all your pet can really do is listen. So maybe, I don't know, our cat has an advantage, right? Because she can't talk back. But I think we talk a lot about the importance of listening. I don't think that we actually really build skills in how to do it well.
Mm.
My favorite approach to listening that I came across is this idea called motivational interviewing. It comes out of counseling psychology. And the premise is that it's very hard to change somebody else's mind, but it's more likely that you could help them find their own motivation to change their mind. And what that means is, let's say, you've got an uncle who you think has a really hateful set of beliefs. Instead of telling him, here's what you should believe, and prosecuting him for being wrong and preaching about why you're right, what you should do is say, I was really interested in how you landed at this set of views. And I was curious about, what the pros are of having that viewpoint, if you've ever experienced any negative consequences of that. And can you just walk me through that? Because I actually don't understand your perspective that well. And then you listen. And what most people do when they're asked to talk about the pros and cons of some stance they have is they'll give you a little bit of both. And then your job is to hold up a mirror and help them see that they might be a little more ambivalent than they thought, that there's more nuance in their own views than they saw before. And then you might just elaborate on, there are two kinds of talk that you hear here. This one is called sustained talk, which is basically a bunch of reasons why they would stick with the status quo. Change talk is, here are some rationales for why I might want to make a shift in my beliefs or my behaviors. And when you hear change talk, the recommendation is not to manipulate people, not to try to influence them, but to say, it actually sounds like you've considered revisiting this view. I was curious, what do you think would be the consequences of making a shift? And what, if you wanted to do that, what might your plan look like? And I've tried this in a bunch of conversations recently, and it is shocking how much less friction it creates and how much more openness not only the other person brings, but how much openness it creates in me. Because I'm not here to give you answers. I am here to learn from you. And I guess that's part of the scientist or scholar mindset in action.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely value that, because I feel that that's where you become a mediator in your own conversation.
Yes.
And you become an observer in your own conversation, rather than looking at it as like, this is my ego versus this person's ego. And you talk a bit about, I wanted you to mention this because I love this. You talk a bit about how it's better to bring up only one or two reasons for your viewpoint in a debate rather than providing a lot of reasons. Tell us about that, because we often think like we have to reel off 10 reasons why this person's wrong. But actually, you're telling us to limit that. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm tempted to pile on too many studies to support this point, which I'll try to avoid. But I will say, studies of expert negotiators compared to average negotiators show that the experts use fewer reasons on average because they're afraid of diluting their argument. And they know, look, Jay, if I give you 9 reasons why my proposal is fair and compelling, and you don't like it, then you're just going to pick the least compelling reason and ignore the other 8. I just give you my 1 or 2 strongest reasons, you're a lot more likely then to take them seriously. And I think the number of reasons obviously matters. There's also the question of how the reasons fit together. And I'd done an experiment at a university a while back where we were trying to get non-donors who'd never given a cent in their lives to their alma mater to think about making a small gift. And we sent them letters, and the big test was, is it better to appeal to the more egoistic or the more altruistic reasons for giving? So some people are told, look, alumni say giving feels good. Others are told alumni really appreciate the opportunity to do good through giving. And we found that both reasons were equally effective. We were able to get over 6% of alums who had never given, often in 30, 40, 50 years, to write a check, which was exciting. Then we said, all right, 2 reasons are better than 1. Let's put them together. And the giving rate dropped in half.
Wow.
There was a little bit of a conflict between, hey, this is going to make you feel good, and hey, this is going to do good and help a lot of people. And when we gave these conflicting or sort of mixed reasons, people were more likely to realize that a persuasive attempt was happening, and they put their guard up and they said, wait a minute, you can't influence me. And I think that just strengthens the case to say, look, you want to be careful not to dilute your argument. You also want to make sure there's some clarity and consistency in the perspective you're bringing to the table.
I love that. And I would say that for anyone who's listening or watching, that's a great takeaway, because I feel like when we're trying to create change, we try and give way too many reasons and way too many ideas and options. And actually, when you really believe something's an issue and there's a challenge and you just speak about it with passion and empathy and you focus in, the other person actually gets more clarity. So I often find, like, when you're talking to someone, the reason it's hard for them to listen is because you're making it harder for them to listen by speaking about far too many things, when actually most of our minds can't focus on more than 3 things, I guess. That bringing up any more than the 2 or 3 you suggested just goes over people's heads and they don't actually understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah, it's amazing how many times I have to relearn that you cannot bully people into agreeing with you.
Yeah.
They'll either fight or they'll choose flight. And I think if you have to watch out for preacher mode, my biggest challenge is prosecutor mode. Yeah. I think that there's something about my personality, my values, and also my training as a social scientist that says if somebody believes something that's inconsistent with rigorous evidence, I feel like it's my responsibility to try to correct their view.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the last time that went well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's why those 3, the preacher, the prosecutor, and the politician, are such great reminders. Anytime we feel we've got one of those hats on, we can politely take it off and go back to being the scientist. And that's the one that gives you so much joy in the long term. You learn more about your partner, you learn more about your colleagues, you learn more about, and when you learn more about someone, you know how to approach them every time. And whereas when you don't learn about them, you approach them in the same way every time and you get the same result.
I think there's so much truth to that. And in fact, I've seen it recently in that I've started telling people that, I've increasingly noticed myself. Yeah, this is a great example of self-persuasion, right? I wrote a whole book about how we need to watch out for slipping into these other mindsets. And I have a habit of going into prosecutor mode when I'm exploring ideas. And if somebody believes one thing, the way that I really try to understand it is I argue the exact opposite. And I know that drives people crazy sometimes. So I've started telling people, I occasionally, and then I have to stop and say, okay, more often than not, when I'm in a disagreement, I become a prosecutor. And if you ever catch me doing that, please feel free to call me out. And I've had people do it. I've also had some early readers of the book now say, hey, that lawyer thing that you wrote about, you're doing it right now. It's a great sort of check yourself moment to say, okay, I just caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror. I do not like the person who's staring back at me right now. That's not who I want to be.
I love that, Adam. Adam, we end every episode of On Purpose, as you know, with a segment called the Final 5, which you have to answer in 1 word to 1 sentence maximum. This is your Final 5. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's start with this question. What's something you wish you had rethought earlier?
I wish I had rethought my decision not to study abroad in college. I wish I had studied abroad in college.
Okay, fine. Yeah, that's clear, because you rethought it and therefore you didn't go.
To be actually clear this time, I decided not to study abroad, and I wish I had rethought that.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Why? Tell us. I'd love to hear that one.
I think I felt extraordinarily fortunate to get into Harvard, and I had a massive case of FOMO before I even knew that there was such a thing as a fear of missing out. How could you take a semester away from this incredible learning opportunity? And it seemed like I would be giving up too much. And of course, what I didn't see was all the things I gave up by not immersing myself in a new culture and a different education system and a set of norms and values that might have been pretty foreign to me.
What's the time when you rethought something where you realized your original thought was actually right?
The title for Think Again was an example on this. The title clicked for me one day. Think Again, the power of knowing what you don't know. Yeah. I love it. That's the book I want to write. And then I gave an early draft to my challenge network, the group of readers who brought a lot of criticism. And some of them said, well, don't you want a different title? Like, what if the book was called I Might Be Wrong or Unlearning? And I rethought it a bunch. And I said, well, I'm actually pretty excited about those titles. And I think they're really novel and compelling. And every time I explained the book to people, there was just something sticky about saying, you know what, whatever you think about that, you might want to think again. And I realized that's a phrase I use all the time, and it captures something that I stand for, and I couldn't let it go.
I love it. I love Think Again. I think it's a great title. And it's interesting. I went through the same thing with Think Like a Monk. So I had pretty much every publisher and imprint that I went to meet tell me they didn't think the book should be called Think Like a Monk.
Are you serious? That is one of the best book titles I've ever seen.
No, seriously, honestly, and I was so insecure about it for a long time, even up until the day before we launched it, because I'd heard that from I met 17 imprints, and I heard that from 14 to 15 of the imprints. That they believe that we should change the title. They were just like, well, Jay, who wants to be a monk? What does a monk mean to people? And I was struggling with alternatives because this was the only true thing that the book was trying to do.
Yeah.
And I felt was my unique offering in the world that I'm trying to, pass along. And so it was so hard. And I'm glad that we stuck with it. But I've rethought it a million times, so I was very scared up until the day we got results in and all the rest of it. I was so scared.
Well, it sounds like the imprints you met with were not your target audience, but I actually think it's an ingenious title for the exact reason that they're highlighting, which is I don't think most people want to be monks, but we all aspire to have the wisdom and also the equanimity that you model. And so the idea that I could, even if I don't have the patience or the discipline to immerse myself in a spiritual tradition like that I could learn to think more like one, that's right at my fingertips, right?
Well, you're my target. Adam, you're always going to be my target audience now, from now on. So I'm going to
I love that title. I think that anybody who told you to rethink it clearly should rethink their role in titling books.
I love that. Well, thank you for that. All right, question number 3. We've been spending so long on these. This is great, but I love it.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Question number 3 is, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever received?
The worst piece of advice that I ever received was not to give credit to undergraduate co-authors on a paper I was writing because they were just research assistants and everyone has them.
Wow. Interesting. That's a great one. Thank you for sharing that. What's the worst piece of advice you've ever given someone?
The worst piece of advice I've ever given someone is probably don't go back to school.
Interesting. Okay. I should talk to you about that. I've been thinking of going back to school. So
interesting. For what?
That's a big question, which I could go into there's 3 different areas that I'm fascinated by. And I think I don't know enough. Again, I don't know enough about what I would end up studying if I end up choosing any of the 3. Broad terms, neuroscience is definitely one of them. I'm fascinated by, my passion's always been to find the juxtaposition or the intersection between timeless wisdom and modern science. And so for me, I'm always trying to find I love reading studies about how meditation impacts the brain, how a lot of my old monk practices affect the brain. And so neuroscience is definitely one of the big ones. I'm behavioral economics books